I've always been interested in landscapes. Recently, only in the last couple of years, I've become interested in the motion of other particles. So not just sediment grains like sand and boulders that sculpt landscapes, but also fine particles, including human-made contaminants that we put into the environment. But the emphasis becomes not so much how they change the landscape around them, but rather how the structure of the landscape and the patterning of the landscape controls the way in which fine particles or contaminants move through. There was a lot of fundamental research on the material behavior of asbestos up to and through the 70s. But once asbestos became understood to be a hazardous material, all of the places that were funding fundamental research into the properties of asbestos stopped funding it because we said, okay, we're going to stop making this now. So once we stopped manufacturing asbestos or asbestos-related materials from its source, we really stopped doing fundamental research on how it behaves. Well, the thing is that technologies have advanced a lot in 30 or 40 years for characterizing fundamental materials, what they're made of, how they behave, what the forces are that act on them. But the science of asbestos hasn't kept pace because research into the basic material properties and behaviors have really been stalled for a long time. When particles get really fine, they can stick together. And sort of the first question that we should ask if we're thinking about how fine particles may move through the environment is, what size do the particles actually take on in the environment? So asbestos fibers are really, really small, right? So they have diameters that are smaller than 1/100th of a human hair. An individual asbestos fiber or an individual clay particle can easily be picked up by the wind and moved great distances, or can easily be breathed into your body and go down into your lungs. But under some conditions, fine particles like asbestos or clay will clump together. So the first interest for us in terms of the research on asbestos is what determines if and how these asbestos fibers clump together, under what conditions they'll form very large aggregates, as we call them. Once then that we solve the problem of what determines the size of these particles in the environment, we then want to work on how these particles move through the environment. The sort of second prong of research for us is the mobility of asbestos through groundwater or porous media. And the reason why we pick up that problem is that, of course, the way that we are exposed to asbestos is by breathing it, and that's the only pathway by which it's harmful. But the idea is that when we contain asbestos in the environment, we usually just dump it in a pile and then cover it with soil so that we don't get it eroded by the wind. And if it's not eroded by the wind and breathed in by our body, then we believe that it's not a problem. But there's a question by some researchers in the community, also by the community that lives in the Superfund site in Ambler, about whether we should be concerned about other pathways in the environment. In other words, when we put asbestos, we just cap it with soil, we know it's not going to be eroded by the wind, but is there a possibility that we'll move through the groundwater and then come up to the surface somewhere else where it could be, wind blown? And so we're trying to understand how aggregates form with asbestos, how the state of aggregates, whether they're clumped or moving as individual fibers, determines if and how they may move through groundwater. We're used to thinking about the mobility of particles out in the environment. The environment's out there, like when you look outside your window. Of course, the other environment of particle transport is the environment inside the human body. And in the biomedical world, there are observations about how particles move through the body, but the biologists don't know nearly as much about the physical and chemical processes going on about particles moving in a fluid through the body and how they stick or don't to different materials in the body. And in my background, coming from the physical perspective, I'm not aware of all these biological implications, and even I'm not used to dealing with the different fluids and different solids like membranes within the body, which can make new processes occur. And so there's new research that's opening up now, even beyond what we directly proposed in our grant. On the other hand, we're interacting with and collaborating directly with the people in the community through our community engagement core. You realize, looking in people's eyes and seeing the questions that they have and realizing that, them trying to relate my tiny little laboratory experiments to what is happening literally in their backyard I feel inspired to do more, and I also feel an impetus to make that connection more directly. And so in terms of opening up new avenues of research between people who would never collaborate together, and in even having this kind of interaction with the community, which actually drives my research in new directions on the other end, I'm getting tugged by these two different communities into doing a kind of research that I wouldn't be doing otherwise.